Welcome to this week's Parsha with Nechama Leibowitz for Parshat Toldot. This week, I decided not to use any of the essays in the book and only to use one of her Gilionot, sort of sway in the other direction from last week. And part of it is because there are just so many interesting topics. It was hard to choose. So I chose something a little off the beaten path, and the essay that she wrote about this topic was not my favorite, but I think the topic is quite good. So let's see here. So I think that if you asked a average person at shul what Parshat Toldot was about, you would not get the story of the wells to be in the answer, right? We would say it's about Esav selling the birthright to Yaakov, and Yaakov dressing up to steal or take, or however you want to think about it, the bracha that Yitzchak was intending to give Esav, and then the beginning of his running away, right? Like the running from, before we get to where he's going next week. But nestled into the middle of that timeline is a very interesting story about Yitzchak digging wells. And this story takes place in the context of Yitzchak repeating a story that happens to his father. There's a famine in the lands of Canaan, and they start to leave. They don't. Yitzchak never leaves the land of Israel, unlike his father and his son. But they go to Avimelech in Gerar, and he says that his wife is his sister, sort of a familiar story. The king understands that this was a lie because he sees in a fascinating pasuk, Yitzchak mitzachek im Rivka. He's yitzchaking, whatever that means, playing with, or sort of, engaging Rivka in a way that makes the king understand that it's his sister. They part peacefully, and he goes to up to Beersheba, and he digs these wells. And again, this is a repeating of what happened with Abraham. The wells had gotten stopped up by the Plishtim who lived in that neighborhood. And Yitzchak redigs the very same wells that Abraham dug. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. It's often glossed over because there's so many other exciting things that happen in this week's Parsha. And I said to my sister, unfortunately, just had a foot surgery. We wish her a refuah shlema, but she's very bored. And so she has all this time to listen to my worries when usually she has her own busy life to attend to. And so I was telling her that we're traveling to my old shul in Philadelphia that I had worked very hard on building. And so I was invited to speak there. So I'm speaking this Shabbat. And I said, I don't want to say anything bad about anybody. Not about Esav, not about Yitzchak, not about Yaakov, not about Rivka, but there's so many questionable choices that are made in this week's Parsha, and it can be very hard. And so the wells are an interesting spot in which to learn, because it's truly just a lovely story. Okay, so that is my long-winded introduction for why I liked this Gilyon. And interestingly, Nechama Leibowitz was very taken by the wells as well. There are several Gilionot on the wells and one chapter in her book. So this is a very brief excerpt from the well story, but it is what these Midrashim and Parshanim will be based on. So we'll read just these 3 psukim from the Parsha, and then we'll look at her question. So Vayal Misham Beersheva, right? Yitzchak goes up from Beersheva. Vayera elav Hashem balayla hahu. Vayomer Anochi Elokei Abraham Avicha Al Tira. Right. So that night, God appears to Yitzchak and says, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be worried. Ki itcha anochi, because I am with you. Uvrachticha v'hirbeti etzarecha ba'avur Abraham avdi." Right. So God comes and says, "Don't be afraid. I will bless you. I will increase your offspring, for the sake of your father Abraham, my servant." Vayiven sham mizbech. So when Yitzchak wakes up, he builds a mizbech there. V'yikra b'shem Hashem vayet sham ohalo. He invokes God by name, as Abraham has done in the past. He pitches his tent there. Vayichru sham avdei Yitzchak ba'ar. They start to build their wells. I'm sorry that I I forgot my transformation again here, in case anyone wants to print this later. So Nechama Leibovich's question, just to find it here for a second, is Ma hakoshi haklali lemefarshim b'parkenu. We're going to look at three different mefarshim, and the question is, what is bothering them, right? What is the question? What's bothering Rashi, right? What's bothering the Midrash and Radak and Rambam? And then Maha Havdel ben Shalosh Hadeo. What is the difference between these three understandings of the question? And she gives us specific directions. So we'll go back to that at the end. So what is the question, right? So the Midrash HaGadol starts. Maybe we'll start with them. We'll try to figure out what the question is as we go. They are commenting on these last 5 words here, right? That the servants start to dig the wells. And it says, Ashrehem letzadikim, the blessing of the righteous, shebachol makom shehem hochin, everywhere that tzadikim go, hin korin ba'orot umotziin et hamayim l'rabim. They dig wells and they find water for the many. So it seems like the Midrash is saying that Yitzchak is doing this like prototypical tzaddik thing, right? What do tzaddikim do? They dig wells and they find water. And of course, I think that the Midrash is saying maybe this isn't necessarily about the digging of an actual well, right? From Mishlei, they bring a pasuk, Makor Chaim Pi Tzadik. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. Right. And so you can imagine that the Midrash is saying here, Yitzchak is doing a good thing. He's setting himself up as a tzaddik. And this is not what Nechama Leibovich says in her chapter, and I don't have the answers to the questions, but I wonder if on some level, the question is like, what do we do in a parsha where all we can say is this person behaved in a questionable way, or that person doesn't act the way we thought she acted in last week's parsha, right? What do? You just do the right thing. You just like do the simple, straightforward, kind of boring thing, right? Yitzchak could have gotten wrapped up in all the family drama, but instead the text takes a break to tell us that Yitzchak was busy just digging wells and finding water. Whether that is actual physical wells or perhaps metaphorical wells, Yitzchak is worried about bringing the fountain of life to the people. And he's not going to get drawn into all the drama that seems to surround him around the parsha. So that is my thought. I welcome other thoughts. But I think also this idea of like, right, when we say like you have to dig deep for something, there's something very nice about this idea, right? Like Yitzchak sees all this stuff on the surface and he digs deep. And what do you find when you like really do the work and dig into yourself? You find the path to life, the water, whatever the thing is. Okay, so that's avenue number 1. The Radak is going to go in a wildly different direction, right? Which is also just interesting. Again, sort of thinking about the goal of Nechama Leibovich and bringing these Gilionot is that there, often we learn like one thing, usually the Rashi or the Midrash, right? And like that is the way that the Pshat is supposed to be understood. But here, she's really giving us a really wide array of understandings of the story. Okay, so let's dig into the Radak. So the Radak, Vayal Misham Be'er-Sheva, right? The very beginning of this chunk, that they went up from there to Be'er-Sheva. Karov Hayal Lasham. Well, it must have been not very far away from Grar, which is where he was before. Umash Amar Vayal, ki Eretz Yisrael hamuchzeket hayta gavoha me'eretz Plishtim. So the Radak is saying there is a physical reason for this, right? The reason it says Vayal Misham, you go up from there, is because the land of the Plishtim is lower down, and the part of Israel that we have occupied is higher up. And it seems like what the Radak is saying is like, that's not just a geographical note, that is also a spiritual note, right? That the land of Israel was on a spiritually higher level than the part occupied by the Plishtim. So either Yitzchak is climbing sort of like out of the valley, or perhaps he's going back to the spiritually elevated place, but that's why it says Vayal. Okay. V'chol hasipurim ha'ela, all of these stories, b'chipurat ha'orot, of digging the wells, v'kriyat ha'shmot l'hodia, right? Because as it was a very small snippet, but there are lots of wells, 7 wells dug, and they all have different names, and we go into all of the different names. Ki be'eretz Yisrael ha'muchzeket haya chofer ba'orot kirtzono. So all these stories about the digging of the wells and the names they were called by were intended to inform us that in the part of Eretz Yisrael traditionally promised to Abraham, his son Yitzchak was digging according to his disputed right. This is a very loose translation. This is the Sfaria translation. Right? No one is in moche beyado. No one is stopping him. The Chayin Karesh Shmot Kirtono, and he can name them whatever he likes. It's on his territory. V'haya b'nei hamakom korino tokein, and everyone calls them the way they are. V'chein Avraham kamosha katavnu, and this was exactly what Abraham had done before, right? V'chol zeh, right? This is what is bothering the Radak, possibly what is bothering the Midrash HaGadol. V'chol zeh haya lahem la'ot v'lasiman ma sheyadam ha'el latet ha'aret lizaram. Right? So what is the purpose of this whole story? All of this was an indication to them of which parts of Eretz Israel God had meant for them to plant seed in. I.e., what are the parts of Israel we're meant to cultivate and develop? Right? Aval plishtim aval pisha hayam Eretz Israel lo huchzaka beyadam. Lefichach rabu imahem al hagvul. The regions in which the Plishtim dwell did not really come under the full control of Bnei Israel until many hundreds of years later. And this accounts for the wars between Israel and the Plishtim because they're understood as border wars, right? The borderline moved back and forth between the Plishtim's territory and the territory of Israel. And that was the dispute here. And there's this interesting note, which I left here. Sefaria is usually very reliable, so I assume that this is correct, that the Radak felt like this would only be settled permanently in the times of Mashiach. And he says an interesting footnote, right, that this is similar to other territorial wars. So I did not look up where the Plishtim live, but my understanding is they're a coastal town, and that they're in the south of Israel. So to me, again, it's just so striking when things in the Torah feel so resonant today, right? That the border wars and the skirmishes. I've been reading this amazing book. I don't think it's on my table right now, by Amir Tabon. I highly recommend it. It's called The Gates of Gaza. He's a journalist for Haaretz, and he lives in Nachal Oz, which is the closest kibbutz to the Gaza border. And there's just a fascinating history of where the borders lie and how they were determined to be where they are. And as I was reading this Radak, I really felt like he was like Amir Tabon, right? Like that there was this border dispute being talked about that is still being talked about, a good 1,000 years after the Radak lived, at least. I'm sorry, I didn't give anyone's dates today. But it seems like the Radak is saying this is an important story to tell here. Right? What is bothering the Radak? Why this story and why here? Right? This is about the covenantal tradition that is getting passed down. That's what Toldot is about on a sort of meta level, right? Who is going to get that covenantal bracha of Eretz and Zera, right? Land and children. And that bracha goes to Yitzchak, but to Yaakov, but it's not a simple path. And so I think the Radak is saying this story does not belong here on the surface of it. And he's saying, but actually it does, because the covenantal bracha of land, right, that this is the land that your people will inherit, it's not clearly defined at this moment. And this is part of a clue of which part of this land is ours and which part maybe is not ours. So much less sort of beautiful on some level about digging wells and tzaddikim and finding water, but very much a spiritual part of like what part of the land is ours, which part do we have full control over, where can we name things and people will call them what they're named, and where do we have to have like a dispute over what something is named or who it belongs to. So another read, right? Another take. And now let's look at the Ramban, which has a third option to present. Who has a third option to present? And then maybe we'll try to synthesize what we've looked at here. So here he is, I apologize, I didn't bring this pasuk, right? He is talking about one of the be'erot, which is called Esek, right? So as I said, the 7 are all names and they go through the names. And so the Ramban says, Yisaper HaKatuv v'yarich b'inyan ha'be'erot. right? There's this lengthy account, right? It seems like the Ramban has the same question as the Radak. Why are we spilling so much ink on the topic of the Be'erot? What is the point here? Ve'em b'pshutei hasipur to'elet v'lo kavod gadol liYitzchak, v'hu v'aviv asu otam b'shaveh. Where there is, when in the literal interpretation of the story, there would seem to be no benefit nor any great honor to Isaac, and that he and his father did the same thing. So first of all, I would like to take issue with the Ramban. I think it's a fascinating question, right? Why are we talking about a story of wells that were stopped up and then redug in the exact same place with the exact same name? Is there a benefit to doing something for a second time? I guess is maybe what the question I would ask. To repainting a monument the same way it had been before, but it had just been eroded, or to, reshelving a library in exactly the same order after you have to clean it or there's water damage or whatever. And I think there is some value to that. The Ramban doesn't necessarily seem to think so. And he feels, right, it seems like he feels like this is like some boring paperwork, a technical issue. Why are we giving so much time to it? And so the Ramban's answer to this, right, what's bothering him, is aval yesh b'davar inyan nistar b'tocho. There must be something hidden inside of this idea that is important. Ki ba lahodia davar atid, right? It's going to teach us something about the future. Ki be'er mayim chayim yirmoz lebeit elokim asher ya'asu banav shel Yitzchak. Because the well of living water alludes to the Beit HaMikdash, which will eventually will be built by the children of Yitzchak. And his proof for that is right. V'lachein hizker be'er mayim chayim kamo Yirmiyahu makor mayim chayim et Hashem. V'kara et harishon Esek. So now this name ends up being very important. Why do we call the first name Esek? Yirmoz l'bayit harishon asher hitasku imanu v'asu otanu kama machlokot v'kama milchamot ad shehachrivuhu. So it's an allusion to the first Beit HaMikdash, where nations contended with us and started wars and fights with us until they destroyed it. The second well, is called Sitna. Shem kasheh min harav.
Excuse me, and they still are.
Pardon?
The biggest bone of contention in Israel is the Har HaBayit.
Exactly. Thank you for saying that, because I totally agree with you. Right. I think to me, this just feels like the Ramban and the Radak could be living in today's world. 100%, right? The Ramban is saying the location of the Beit HaMikdash Har HaBayit, right, is that is what these wells signify. Interestingly, I was reading somewhere that the wells actually, right, so some of them they're in Rehovot, which, right, the Ramban is going to connect to Har HaBayit, but like we actually know where Rehovot is. So this is not necessarily on the location of Har HaBayit, but it's an allusion to Har HaBayit and to the Beit HaMikdash, right? So the first Esek contention that the location of our Har HaBayit has always been a contention. Then the second well is called Sitna, which is a harsher name than the first. And right, the Ramban says that this is because the Bayit Hasheni was always more contentious, right? Even in the beginning of his reign, they wrote Sitna against the inhabitants of Judah and Yerushalayim. And during its entire existence, they were a source of enmity unto us until they destroyed it. The Hashlishi, the third well, is called Rehovot. Hu habayit ha'atid sheyivneh b'mehera b'yaminu. This refers to the third Beit HaMikdash, which will be spacious, which will have room for everybody, right? Which will be this beautiful space of peace, right? It won't have enmity and it won't have contention. And so for the Ramban, it feels like a boring piece of paperwork, but it is like that you have to file, right, when you build a well. But in fact, it is talking about the promise of a third Beit HaMikdash that will be Rehovot, that will be spacious, that will have room, where there will no longer be contention. And so it's almost like a bracha of peace hidden, tucked inside this very boring piece of like bureaucratic red tape around wells being opened and wells being shut. Right. So if we were to answer the questions, right? I think the first question is like, what is this doing here? It doesn't feel like it fits into the theme. And then what is the difference between the three dayot? I guess I'll turn it to you. I don't have to talk the whole time. What are some of the differences, right? Like the Radak, it seems like it's talking about a geographical concern, right? Where are our boundaries? Where do they lie? The Ramban seems to be speaking about like almost like a nevuah, a prophecy of future spiritual life in Israel, but like a very concrete Beit HaMikdash space, not like just sort of general spirituality. And I think the Midrash Hagadol is much more open, right? Much more like a Musari kind of answer, perhaps, right? What is the story of the wells doing here? It's meant to be telling us how tzaddikim behave. I would argue in a parsha in which we don't see a lot of that behavior. Um, I think those are the three different dayot that are outlined here. And I agree with this assessment, right? That the Radak and the Ramban, holchim bekivun echad, like they're going in one direction together. But there is a big difference between them. They're both speaking about sort of future outlines of Israel in one way or another. Um, from my understanding, the Radak is not necessarily a spiritual outline as such, although obviously the borders of Israel do have a spiritual sort of reality to them. Um, Whereas the Ramban is really speaking much more about like a nevuah of a third Beit Hamikdash that feels a little bit more spiritual to me. But I certainly welcome other suggestions. We can't hand in our Gillion, so
It seems very current today.
yeah.
This could be going on in the Knesset. Well, it is going on in the Knesset.
Say more. What do you mean?
Uh, the whole land, building the third house. Yes. Yeah.
I agree. I found it like shockingly current.
Relevant.
Yeah. Relevant. And it feels to me, so as I said, my sister was my wonderful chavruta this week, and she said, it feels like there's something about that, like we dug holes and they filled them up, and now they're digging holes and we're filling them up. Right. Like, and she was referring to the tunnels, I think, which is a whole different direction than either of these. But I said, like it's true. It does, like everything about the Ba'orot feels very current to me today. Um, and I think you're right. I think that sometimes in this story, right, there's like a lot of internal and external challenges in this parsha. And I think often we focus only on the internal challenges, right? Like the sort of the infighting between brothers, between spouses, between parents and children. And this story is largely a story of external struggle, right? The Plishtim and against Yitzhak. But I think that with these mefarshim, with these commentaries, they're actually transforming this external issue into one that might even be more internal, right? As Bobby said, like the fight is in the Knesset right now. There are many fights right now, but one of them is there, right? We can always find a way to make an external fight an internal fight as well. And I think that that's an interesting piece. I don't know if that was the purpose, if the Ramban or the Radak were thinking about that, but I think that that was a piece of it for me. But yes, I think border wars, especially with people who live on the land where the Plishtim lived, thinking about where we build and where we don't build, where we have the right to name things and we don't have the right to name things. Fascinating. And this Gillion is from 1964. I looked up the date on this one.
So it's pre-67.
Yes, that's another interesting point, right? It is both not wartime and it is pre-expanded borders. And before we had a unified Jerusalem.
Right. When you asked the question before about why so much being written, or as you said, so much ink being spilled about the Beirut, the wells, and it says specifically that it's like that Yitzchak did it just like his father did it, and the result was sitna. So I was looking when I was going over the Parsha today. I saw that, and then it reminded me the great late Dr. One second. The great late Dr. Reb Hillel Zeidman, the father of Naomi Zeidman, in his
Hmm.
Parsha article once, he said on this week's Parsha, he says, Sidna, it's just pure hatred that they had to deal with. And he was referring, I'm sure he was associating it with how relevant it is that they're just the pure Sina of Ishmael or the pure Sina of Edom, of Esav.
Hmm.
He said
Mm-hmm.
that's why it's called Sitna, just pure hatred, not for any specific reason, sort of like Amalek.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And here with the police team, right, it feels like they're cutting off their own nose to spite their face, right? The well of water is valuable. Why would you stop up a well, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense. So I think that even drives that point, right? You have to really hate to hurt yourself along with your enemy. Um, yeah,
That
and I
was in
think,
one of his Yiddish articles,
cool.
and
Um,
he used to speak to me about it as well.
wow, that's awesome. Um, yes, so I agree. I think that's a piece of it for sure. I brought the second part of the Gilyon here. I know we don't have a lot of time because I think it actually addresses the issue that you were starting to bring up, Rabbi Schwartz, which is why do the police team, and Avimelech, why are they so upset with Yitzchak? And part of it from the Pshat, for sure, seems to be because Yitzchak has amassed an enormous amount of wealth through his travels. And here, the wording that is used is very interesting. Vayomer Avimelech el Yitzchak, lech me'imanu ki atzamta mimenu ma'od. Avimelech says to Yitzchak, go away from us because you have become far too big for us. And Nechama Leibovitz brings several more psukim which have a very similar sound to them, right? And she asks, "Ha'im perush hamila mimenu bepsukenu hu keperush mimenu be'echad hapsukim habayim?" Does the context feel the same? So, right. So, just to remind us here, Avimelech is talking to Yitzchak,
We
saying,
lost the screen.
"Oh,
Yeah, my screen up. Now I got it
you
now.
see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure I probably touched something too many times. So, right. So, Yitzchak has become a threat to Avimelech or the police team because he is too big, a tzamta. He has too much stuff, right? And the next pasuk, Vayomer el amo, right? This is Paro talking to the people. Hine am b'nei Israel rav va'atzum mimenu, right? Same shoresh here of atzum as atzamta up here, right? And this is the very beginning of the Melech Chadash in Egypt, who enslaves Bnei Israel, right? So now here, um, I will admit I did look at the answers that Rabbi Bieler provides so nicely, and I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with him. I think here we're talking about too many people, right? There are too many, right? What does Paro say that we've become like insects, like we sort of multiply and have spread out too far? And Yitzchak doesn't have that many children, right? I don't think that's the same context. To me, the fear feels the same, but what is atzum seems to be different. I think for Yitzchak, it's his rechush, it's his property. And in Shmot, he's referring to the number of us, the number of people. Then in Devarim, this is the order they were listed on the sheet. It is not in chronological order. The next two, interestingly, are this is where we're speaking, right? Where Bnei Israel is speaking, as opposed to like our opposition, right? Ana anachnu olim achinu Hemasu et levavenu lemor am gadol veram. So not the same samta, but rav vatsum, right? Sort of similar. Gadol veram mimenu arim gadolot uvitzurot b'shamayim v'gam b'nei anakim ra'inu sham. Right? These are the miraglim saying that, or Bnei Israel saying that the miraglim have said, right, that they are too strong within the borders of Israel, right? Stronger and taller than we are, cities with high fortified walls and even maybe giants of some sort or another.
Who, but the Meraglim is speaking about the people in Canaan, that they're the Anakim, that they're
Yeah.
stronger than us, right?
Yes. That's, I think it's interesting, right? That the psukim, again, it's a different, it's sort of a different context. And here, even the roles have switched. We are no longer the thing that is atzum v'rav, or rav atzum. Now we feel small, right? In this parsha, we even say we feel like the grasshoppers, right? And the anakim are like we'll feel like grasshoppers compared to the anakim, to the giants. So here,
Right,
Bnei
and
Israel
then if I
is,
can just interrupt you, two quick things, and
sure.
then the Rashi changes it because it does, the pasuk doesn't say Chagavim, that we were in their eyes as Chagavim. It says we were, and so we were in their eyes, and Rashi changes that to we were like a bunch of little ants, Nimalim, in their eyes. That's how small we were.
Hmm. And
And
possibly,
Talmai
yeah, go
and
ahead.
the beautiful Kedushas Levi, based on that Rashi, that he says, what is Talmai saying? Talmai is one of the four Anakim, and Talmai says, there are a bunch of ants, but again, there were many, many ants running around, and he says that an ant never steals from another ant. So
Hmm.
that was his proof that the Jews will never be able to get Eretz Yisrael because they're never going to be able to steal it away from him.
Hmm. Interesting. So I also have heard that Rashi, one of my favorite things to teach is about Og, one of the last giants. And the Midrash tells us that how was he defeated is that he was holding a mountain over the head of the camp of Bnei Israel. And God sent ants that climbed up and chewed like a hole in the mountain, and the mountain fell on top of Og's head. And that's how he was defeated. And so perhaps the issue of the Chagavim is about perspective, right? Sometimes when we are small, we feel small, and sometimes when we're small, we say we are small and mighty. So many ways to read that this parsha, but for sure, however we read it, Bnei Israel is saying, right, that they are bigger than us. They are too big from us, and that we, almost like we should go away, right? They're sending themselves away. We shouldn't go in because they're too big. And then similarly, the anashim asher alu imo amru lo nuchal la'alot el ha'am ki chazaku mimenu. And so I think that Rabbi Bieler said that, and then there's one more from Malachim Aleph, where the Avdei HaMelech, the ministers of the king of Aram, say to him, Elav Elokei Harim Elohehem Al Kain Chazku Mimenu. Their God is a God of mountains. That is why they got the better of us, right? They were stronger than us. V'ulam nilachem itam b'mishur im lo nechzak mehem. So what Rabbi Bieler says is that the last three are about physical strength, and the first two are about more monetary strength, like a different type of strength. I'm not sure if that's what Nechama Leibovich was thinking or not. Again, I didn't see the first two as similar. I felt like one was about monetary and one was about maybe not physical, like, like strong, but physical, like many, like a pile of ants is very effective, right? But in each of these cases, it's interesting to see, again, without like a concordance, I'm just always amazed when people can pull these things together pre-Safaria, right? That she saw this pattern, which I thought was cool. But certainly it seems like some of the enmity is coming from them being perceived as a threat of some sort or another. And then I think just quickly in maybe our last minute here, is a question. Hold on. A question here, let's skip to here, about Nechama Leibovich pulls our attention to this pasuk from the story of Yaakov and Lavan, and says that Avimelech and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Lavan have a similar interaction. Right, so this is the pasuk she draws our eye to. V'yishma et divrei b'nei Lavan lemor. לאמור לקח יעקב את כל אשר לאבינו, ומאשר לאבינו עשה את כל הכבוד הזה. Right, so they are talking about Yaakov is listening to Lavan's son saying that Yaakov had taken all that was our father's, right, Lavan's, and that he built up his wealth in this way. And this is talking about the sheep that are spotted versus the sheep that are not, right? That Lavan says, well, you can have these sheep, and overnight I'm sorry that I always get these things mixed up. But like the sheep that are spotted are Yaakov's, and there were a few of them, but then the next morning there are many of them, right? And I think that what she is saying, what her question is, right? What is the ta'anat haplishtim kan and the ta'ana of Lavan is that somehow our success, our as Yitzchak or Yaakov or our as Jews, right, is that it's built upon the wealth that was given to us, like a handout, right? We got a handout and then somehow we were able to like make it into something bigger, but we didn't really deserve it, I think is what I hear here. And I think that it's an interesting anti-Semitic trope, right? This idea, first of all, I think the idea of Paro and the idea of Avimelech are both things that people often say about Jews, right? Like, oh, they've amassed a lot of wealth, and that's why they're threatening to us, or they have a lot of power, right? The Israel lobby, the weapons lobby, whatever, right? The lobbies are, we have to be careful of them. They have so much power. And also, even if we think about our internal fighting, right? Like who has to be drafted to the army and who isn't drafted, and who has too many children and who pays taxes, right? But this idea that like we are atsum in number, right? That we have lots of children, we reproduce too quickly, right? That's certainly like through the children in the Nile, but also many other times in history. And this idea that as Lavan and Avimelech say that like somehow, right, that the wells came from their territory, the Plishtim's territory. And so all of the wealth that resulted from that water comes from them, or that all of the sheep that result from Yaakov's flocks, right? When we know that Yaakov worked very hard and maybe Lavan didn't work very hard, that somehow we don't deserve the things that we do have. And so if you think about the second part of the shiur, and then you think about the first part, to me, they're very different messages. I think the first part is about like, how do we find our ba'orot? How do we go up in spirituality when we're in the land of Israel? How do we actualize the nevuah of Beit HaMikdash of Rechovot, of wide expanse? How do we dig into our wells and find mayim to bring to the Rabbim, right? It's such an internal message of like finding that strength. And the second part really is about like the forces that constrain us from achieving those goals. And I think that they're both very real, and they were both very real in 1964, and they were real in the time of Radak, and they're real right now. And figuring out when to focus on, being the tzaddikim who find the mayim and who build the third Beit HaMikdash, and when to focus on worrying about the Paros and the Avimelechs that surround us, can be very difficult. And that I think that part of why it's nestled in the middle of a much bigger and very important covenantal drama is to say like it's always going to be here. And the trick is figuring out how to deal with it and how to address it and recognizing its importance, right? That there's something nistar, that there's something hidden amongst it, that there's a greater significance to these things, and not just to treat them as like filing things in City Hall, but to really give these matters the importance that they deserve. So I was very inspired by this Gilyon. I think it's a beautiful one. And I welcome thoughts, ideas, questions.
Well, I thought it was beautiful, it was very enriching. And many years ago, I read a book by Rabbi Arthur Green, who was a conservative reconstructionist, theologian, mystic, whatever. And the idea that stuck with me was that he said that we usually seek for God on high in heavens, but God is everywhere, and there are lots of examples they're looking for God in the depths, and they use the well as the instrument to go.
That's
And
beautiful.
several sites, this was one of them. But the wells that, of course, Jacob, Isaac, and so many others later on.
Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful.
Well,
Yeah,
there's
there's so many depths, literal and metaphorical. Sorry,
that's there's a basic tenet of Hasidus from the Baal Shem Tov that we're not interested in going up to heaven, but we're interested in bringing heaven down to earth,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
similar to
Yeah,
what he
I
was
think the
just
Sfat
saying.
Emet also talks about that in this week's Parsha. Interesting.
And when
Right.
looking,
Also, I was just commenting, I wrote it in the chat after the 67 war, when you talk about how they say that we got whatever we got because we got it from other people, or because we're bloodsuckers or whatever, we amassed wealth. So a Polish woman said to a cousin of my mother's, who herself was a Jew from Poland, the survivor of Auschwitz. So a Polish woman said to her, well, of course the Jews were victorious in 1967. That's because they learned how to be good soldiers in the Polish army before the war.
It's right. It's a crazy thing. And look, I don't think it's specifically anti-Semitic, meaning I was just at a dinner with David Brooks, a fundraiser where David Brooks was speaking, and he talked about illuminators, and I forget the contrasting word, but the contrasting word was basically saying like, anything you do, anything someone says to you, you upscale it. So they're like, oh, I had a terrible day. I had to wait for the subway for 10 minutes. And you're like, oh, let me tell you about the time I waited for 2 hours, right? Like that's just sort of human nature, is that we want to one up, not necessarily to make the other feel bad, but to sort of make it about yourself again, right? And so like I think it is anti-Semitic, and that's what a crazy story. I could imagine any one of my neighbors, or my bubby's neighbors saying that about anything. Oh, your bubby like learned how to do the laundry because she saw me have to hang out so many things for my kids, or what. But it's a crazy pattern.
On the other hand, there's an interesting film about Jews in the military during World War II, among other things. And some of the people interviewed in that film make it clear that they learned how to fight by being in the British Army during World War II, and then used it against the British during
Hmm.
the War of Independence and all that.
Well, the truth is
Interesting.
that Moshe Dayan considered himself, or was considered, a student of Wingate
Oh,
in
Wingate taught him
fighting in World
everything
War
he
II.
knew. Or
Right,
Wingate taught him how to be a soldier. Absolutely.
right, right.
Mhm. Look, and I think it's an interesting question of whether the wells really belong to the police team, if it was on their land, or whether the hard work of digging the well, right? Meaning we all have to use resources that are given to us. No one, thank God, at least today, has to fight for every single thing that they get, right? Some things are handed to some people. What you do with it is sort of more interesting than where you got it from in a lot of ways. Right? Moshe Dayan could have been a bad soldier, even if he had a good teacher, right? But he was able to use it in a way that worked for him.
In one of the miscellaneous classes I took with Esther Schkopp, I think it was, who's really quite the history buff when it comes to the biblical lands. But I believe, if I have this straight, she pointed out that the Philistines, the Plishtim, were coastal people, and ships and trade and all that. They were not agriculturists, nor were they
Mm-hmm.
herdsmen. So when it came to food and, the other things that other culture provides, they simply were marauders. They were raiders. And so there'd be constant conflict on the borders because the
Mm,
Philistines would just go take what they want.
mm,
And the rest of the peoples, it wasn't just the Israelites, would really have to fight for keeping their turf.
mm.
So I have another question. Did one of your kids do that little drawing behind you? And are they leaves on the wall that are falling
This
off
is
the tree? That's
I'm very
fabulous.
proud of this. This is this is our gratitude wall for the month of Cheshvan.
Oh, your
Um,
gratitude wall.
and I
Oh,
found, thank you for asking, Bobby. I love to show this off. I found this at Home Goods. and it says a thankful tree on it. And it had its own leaves, but we made our own leaves. So every night at dinner, almost every night at dinner, the kids filled out a leaf. And so we put some on the tree and then we tried to make it look like they were sort of blowing in the wind above us.
Lovely.
And they are really lovely. Kids are so interesting in what they are thankful for.
That's fabulous. And the gratitude WhatsApp with the shiur is lovely.
Oh, I'm so glad you enjoy. I know I always get
cool.
sad around this time of month when it's almost over for the year, but thank God there's always next year. I loved your gratitudes this month, Bobby. They were great. And it was great when like people picked it up and, started the train back up again. So that's awesome.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
You too.
Have a happy
I
one.
look
Have a
forward
good
to
one.
seeing you all
Okay.
in. Thank you. Thank you. Next Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And a reminder that if you would like to participate in our winter Beit Midrash, which is focusing on Cheshvan, which is focusing on Hanukkah, that is starting on Monday night. And you just need to fill out the the Chavruta form. It's free of charge. I'm just going to post that in the chat for anyone who wants it. Bobby was there last time. She is, I think, signed up again, right? So
Yeah,
she.
but my chavruta
Yeah.
won't be able to do it this time.
I want to sign up for it also.
Amazing. Here, let me just click the form. It was
This
really
is
fun
on
last
site.
time.
This is not digital, right?
This is on site. Yes, at the shul in the Burger Beit Midrash.
Okay.
I think it will be a really great session. I'm going to match chavrutas on Thursday and Friday, so please fill it out if you want to do it. Of course, we'll always make room for people if they fill it
I
out
believe
late,
I
but
signed up, but
you did sign up also. Yes, thank you, Judith. And you also did it the first time, right?
most of it, yeah.
Yeah, so Judith can attest that if you miss a week, it's not the end of the world. Still worth signing up for.
All weather
Um,
permitting too.
I mean, yes, hopefully not too bad a winter, not too bad a December. Okay, wonderful.
How
I
do
look
I
forward
sign up? How do I sign up?
use the link that I just sent. Just to fill out some information so we can set you up with a good chavruta. Sort of.
And you sent it where?
It's in the chat.
In chat. Oh, okay.
That little, you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Well, have a happy Thanksgiving, a good Shabbos, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too. Have a good
Thank
Shabbos.
you. Thank you.